Hi everyone, and welcome to the opening video lecture for week 8. This week, we're looking at the victim-perpetrator relationship through the interdisciplinary lens of collective psychopathology. I'll explain that in a second. Big picture-wise, we're picking up on a couple of important themes of the course. Going back to week 3, we're reconsidering yet again the constructed nature of the victim group. However objectively real a genos may be, the perpetrators definitely imagine them in extremely subjective, if not hallucinatory ways. I've also touched upon the idea that the perpetrators almost always have their own narrative, self-imagining themselves as the real victims, with their actual targets instead cast as the evil villains. So there's an imaginary dimension to the etiology of genocide, and that's our focus this week. Reading 1 is by British historian Mark Levine, whose multi-volume world history of genocide we'll be reading a lot of in next semester. Our selection comes from Volume 1 of his project, wherein he sets forth his conceptual approach and theoretical argument. And even though he's a historian, his argument is rooted more in social psychology and political sociology than historiography per se. Reading 2 is by French political scientist Jacques Semelin, whose intellectual career began with civil resistance against the Nazis, before publishing this book here, which was his major contribution to genocide studies. More recently, he's expanded his interest in resistance to include genocide studies more generally. Now, before I continue, please note that there are a couple of errors in your PDF reading packet this week. In the first place, for reading 2, pages 18 to 21 are missing. Now, I've scanned these pages and put them under the supplemental reading folder for this week, but it wouldn't be the end of the world if you simply just skipped over these pages. But they're here if you wanted. Secondly, the entirety of reading 3 is not included either, but I'll include a PDF as well. It's by the German psychologist Evelyn Linder, who's done a lot of work on the roles of emotion in global security, particularly how sentiments of humiliation spur conflict. Now, this isn't required reading, but theoretically it's very interesting. Okay, first of all, a bit of warning on Mark Levine, whose writing style sometimes feels long-ended, a bit wordy, and digressive. So this somewhat challenging reading is made more difficult by the fact that he's making a theoretical argument. So my advice is to follow as closely as you can, but this is definitely a case where your critical reading skills are required. Just track the main points of his argument, don't get lost in the weeds. Anyways, reading 1 begins by considering some various examples of the genos, or the targeted group of genocide. So what is it that makes a genos? Some groups are objectively real in some sense, such as the European Jews, Ottoman Armenians, the Rwandan Tutsi. On the surface, these groups seem to share some common features of a minority population, but other targeted groups are not so real, such as the Soviet kulaks. Technically, the term kulak identified independent peasant proprietors, but this really wasn't a self-identifiable group. Rather, the Soviets used the socio-economic distinction to identify class-based enemies of the communist revolution. So there's really nothing objectively real that makes a genos. What all these groups have in common, he argues, is how the perpetrators see these groups. There are 2 features to this crucial factor. Firstly, roles are almost entirely reversed, the victim group being accused of a crime so heinous that it is perceived as a direct threat to the body and soul of the perpetrator's state and people. Secondly, however politically or socially diverse in actual practice, the victim group in genocide is always defined as a monolith, whose sole and single-minded reason of being is to accomplish the destruction of the perpetrator community. So herein lies Levine's etiological argument. Genocide, he argues, is rooted in collective human psychopathology. That is, the perpetrator's collective unreason that there really does exist an intense struggle between themselves and the victims. He quotes some notorious perpetrators who frame the victims as dangerous subversives who threaten to undermine or even destroy the perpetrator group in a competitive geopolitical system. There's some serious psychological projection going on in these cases. Projection is a concept derived from Freud, and it refers to a cognitive bias in which one sees their own traits in others. Often used as a defense mechanism, projection involves perceiving a threatening trait in others while also denying that same trait within oneself. Genocide involves an extreme form of projection to the point where such cognitive biases become almost totally detached from reality. Levine thus gives considerable attention to the infamous anti-Semitic tract the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in order to exemplify the phantasmic nature of Nazi anti-Semitism, or the idea that the Jewish threat was somehow supernatural, or at least not readily seen by the naked eye. Again, for all of the faults of Goldhagen's thesis, if you recall from earlier this semester, it's clear that the Nazis had some seriously obsessive fantasies about the Jews, who were thus cast as the demonic source of all of the world's ills. Indeed, this latter element captures the eschatological nature of perpetrators, who have an apocalyptic worldview, and who promise ultimate redemption for their followers. So this brings us to a key paradox. On the one hand, genocide is often one-sided, with an actual power differential between the perpetrators and the victims. Genocide thus tends to be defined, or at least described, by an inability on the part of the targeted group to defend themselves, or strike back in such a way as to noticeably halt or impede the killing. On the other hand, the perpetrators tend to see themselves locked in an existential conflict with their actual victims. Thus, genocide also evokes a sense on the part of the perpetrators that the targeted group is a genuine and serious threat to the well-being of the state and/or dominant society. This latter point may be pure fantasy, so it may feel like we're blaming the victim here. Indeed, this really is an unsettling argument, as it requires us to lend a certain degree of credence to their fantastical worldviews. But we have to take seriously this collective psychopathology in order to understand the etiology of genocide. Moving on to reading 2, Simmeline further analyzes this fundamental tension between objectively real conflicts and subjectively imagined threats. His ideological argument combines the insight of psychotherapy with political sociology. He begins by laying out a series of countervailing arguments about the causes of genocide. The particular danger to be averted, he says, is privileging one factor, be it economics, demographics, or culture, over others. These are all objective factors that variably contribute to the ideological equation of causes. But what's missing from this equation is a certain interpretation or state of mind from opinion leaders who are motivated to purify and destroy. Much like Levine in reading 1, Simmeline's key explanatory factor is rooted in collective psychopathology, whereby such violence is driven by a certain mental process, a way of seeing some other being, of stigmatizing him, debasing him, and obliterating him before actually killing him. Thus we have another version of the normalization thesis. Simmeline argues that the social dynamics that can lead to genocide are in fact latent on our school playgrounds or neighborhoods. The key factors here are the identification of scapegoats, a radicalized antagonism between friend and enemy, and, worse yet, killing as an act of purification. This latent potentiality becomes actualized in situations of crisis and existential anxiety. So look at the 3 case studies examined by Simmeline. What could 1930s Germany, late 1980s Yugoslavia, and early 1990s Rwanda possibly have in common, he asked? In these 3 countries, the situation was exacerbated by a serious economic crisis that not only deprived many individuals of access to jobs and income, but also increased the feeling of anxiety with respect to an uncertain future. Difficult life circumstances thus provide a basis for a political constituency for the perpetrator group. In such circumstances, people yearn not only for a sense of security, but for a catch-all explanation of their plight. People need a scapegoat, or a group that can be targeted for unmerited blame. In its most extreme form, a paranoid security imperative becomes at stake, whereby the in-group's existence threatened by an out-group. Genocidal violence can thus become rationalized as a form of self-preservation, whereby we have to destroy them in order to save us. Thus, Simmeline is also grappling with the perpetrator-victim paradox. Just how imaginary or real is this relationship? He suggests that it's a little bit of both. The imaginary feeds on real phenomena to distort the reality of those it designates as victims to make this reality truly frightening. Imaginary and real thus seem inextricably linked, he argues. Ideology operates at the intersection of the imaginary and the real, and it acts as a common binding agent for impetus behind such imaginary constructs. Combined with the natural logic of self-preservation, such an ideological operation produces what he calls a delusional rationality from which an outsider's perspective may appear to be totally divorced from reality, but from an insider's perspective actually makes perfect sense. Now, Reading 3 comes from an edited volume that focuses on cases of so-called subaltern genocides, where ostensibly oppressed groups, whether real or imagined, seek to gain revenge and liberation by waging genocide against their oppressors, again, whether real or imagined. Examples of this include colonial revolts or slave uprisings. You see here an image on the book cover of the Haitian Revolution, whereby slaves massacred their former oppressors. The examples from this volume are varied. For example, there's another chapter in this book about the Serbian nationalists who saw themselves as historical victims. Again, this idea of being a victim can be a major motive element for perpetrator groups. Anyways, the argument here in Reading 3 reiterates a key theme of Lesson 8a. The author argues that the root of genocides does not lie in ethnic fault lines, dwindling resources, quote-unquote rational conflicts of interest, or any general quote-unquote evil of human nature or modernity, but rather, she argues, in a complex psychological mindset and behavioral clusters that exhibit their own homicidal, and also often suicidal, rationality. The author thus follows Levine and Semmeline in confronting the perpetrator-victim paradox. The assumption that genocide's victims belong to a less powerful group needs to be destabilized. Thus, she asks, what turns powerless people to such an imaginary threat? The key factor in this equation is the sentimentality of humiliation, or the sense of the enforced lowering of a person or group, a process of subjugation that damages or strips away pride, honor, and dignity. Humiliation is powerful that it may transform what is regarded as rational self-interest into a redress of humiliation and protection against future humiliation. Described as the nuclear bomb of emotions, humiliation may encourage extreme strategies that pursue a mystical transcendence, a quasi-religious achievement realized only after death. Okay, and that's it for Lesson 8a. I'll continue our discussion of the perpetrator-victim relationship in Lesson 8b, where I'll also wrap up with the final steps of the semester. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.